Global temperatures are set to break new records over the next 5 years. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu and this is The Heat. As the world continues to battle the climate change crisis, there are new alerts about the challenges ahead. A report by the UN's World Meteorological Organization warns there is a strong likelihood that a key climate marker will be breached for at least 1 year, sometime between now and 2027. That is the 1.5 degrees Celsius figure, which was so critical during negotiations leading to the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement.
There's a 66% chance that we would exceed 1.5 degrees during the coming 5 years, and there's 33% probability that we would see the whole coming 5 years exceeding that threshold 1.5 degrees, which is of course not very likely to happen. It's practically sure that we will see the warmest year on record during the coming 5 years once this La Nina phase is over.
Okay, to talk about all of this, joining me now from Virginia is Paul Bledsoe. He is an adjunct lecturer at American University Center for Environmental Policy. Also with us from Seattle is Yixing Xu. He is a former research director with Breakthrough Energy. With us too from Phoenix is Mahmoud. He is director of the Climate and Water Program with the Middle East Institute. And joining me right here in the studio is CGTN correspondent Callebs. He's reported extensively on the climate crisis. Welcome to all of you. Sean, let's start right here in the studio. And let us start with that report from the World Meteorological Organization. The main takeaway: the annual global surface temperature will exceed that critical 1.7 degree Celsius mark for at least 1 year in the next 5 years. How significant is this, and isn't it probably earlier than we anticipated?
It's very significant. Whether it's earlier than we anticipated, perhaps, but I think it should not come as a surprise to a lot of people. How many stories have you read over the last decade? This is the warmest year on record. This is the warmest year on record. And one thing about that 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature, that makes it basically twice as hot on the surface. So basically, we look at places to live in two ways. It's either too cold to live in that place, or it is too hot to live in that place. So the real concern, I think, and I'm not a scientist, I've just covered this and talked to people really over the last 30 years, is hearing time and again that we are steamrolling toward this record heat. And basically 1/5 of the world population is at risk of living in places that are simply too hot within the next several decades. And what happens when that occurs? So there's real reason for concern out there, and there's a real reason for alarm. And the fact that Paris was 8 years ago, and the Trump administration clearly set the United States back significantly in its efforts to continue to try to combat climate change. If you look at the U.S. is the biggest consumer, it's the second biggest polluter, and for decades it was the largest polluter. For it not to do its share, there are a lot of people out there who argue this is feeding into that, and it's really, it's always been the United States that nations look to be the lead, and the fact that it hasn't for such a long time, and now trying to under the Biden administration, but it has been handicapped to a degree by the very staunch conservatives, but it's a real concern, and I don't. It's not a surprise, but I hope it doesn't get worse in the next 5 to 10 years.
Paul Bledsoe, that 1.5 degree marker that we talk about, it's seen as critical by climate experts across the globe, like yourself. Then, of course, we have emissions and a likely El Nino weather pattern, which are all contributing to this warming threat. Have we sort of now reached a red alert scenario and a good reason to actually respond far more aggressively?
That's right. The truth is we do not know where there are tipping points in the global climate system. Scientists have identified more than a dozen tipping points in natural systems, things like the loss of Arctic sea ice, that would tip climate change into an even faster heating scenario. It would take net climate inhibitors like sea ice that now reflect sunlight and warmth back out of the atmosphere into net climate contributors where open water would absorb that heat. We are on the precipice, perhaps, of runaway climate change that will be impossible to stop. And the truth is, scientists don't know where that line is. We need to focus especially on the super pollutants. And the most important of these is methane, which is responsible for 25% of warming, but is uniquely important in limiting near-term temperatures. If we focus an all-out effort on cutting methane, as I've called for and my colleague Durward Zelke and others have called for at COP28, we can reduce global temperatures by almost 0.5 degrees Celsius over what they would otherwise be by 2050. To put that in context, even the most aggressive reductions of CO2 over that period would not reduce warming so much. So we need a tremendous focus on methane. I have, in fact, called on the United Arab Emirates, who are hosting COP28, to bring together the world's largest nationally owned oil and gas companies, who are 75% of global CO2 and methane emissions from oil and gas.
Right.
So the lion's share of emissions from oil and gas, to make an emergency effort at COP28 for an agreement to cut methane. Because if we don't cut methane in over the time period of the next decade deeply, we may have runaway climate change, which will be almost impossible to stop.
Okay, so Paul, when you talk about runaway climate change, what's the real world impact of that?
Right, so what that will mean is that natural systems will move from net inhibitors of warming to contributors. And under scenarios of runaway climate change in the natural systems, we're talking about 3 or 4 degrees of Celsius above pre-industrial levels in this century. And that will mean that there are huge heat waves that will kill people around the world, that will destabilize global agriculture, that will undermine the security and safety of countries around the world, especially sub-Saharan Africa, parts of Asia, will lead to mass migration. We're talking about really horrible, destabilizing scenarios that will happen around the planet. I do not believe that our global leaders truly understand how close we are to these scenarios.
Yixing Xu, this report also talks about the next 5 years being the hottest on record. How concerned is China about this? I mean, what kind of impact will this scenario have on the country?
Yeah, I think definitely it's going to affect China and all the other countries in the world. I think to be specific for China, it's a very big country with a lot of people, and a lot of the Chinese economy is along the coast. So if it happens, the sea level is going to rise, mass migration, maybe millions of people need to move to other places. And also it's going to affect China's trade with the world quite a bit. Because a lot of trading depends on shipping, and if the temperature rise so fast, it's going to affect the coastal communities and also the ports specifically. So I think it's going to hurt China really bad, but also all the other countries around the world. And this is also why we want to continue the effort of climate mitigation, but also climate adaptation, which means we have to accept the reality that the climate change is already happening. The temperature is already rising. In the next 5 years or even 10 years, it's going to be even worse to combat climate change. And we have to adapt a lot of things in our society to make sure that people can survive, the economy can continue to develop. For example, we may need to reinforce our ports to make sure that the shipping is not heavily affected by this.
Right, Yixing Xu, you talk about transportation and communications infrastructure being affected. What about things like food security? Will that be impacted very heavily?
For sure, that's going to be impacted. The food system, agriculture system relies on the temperature or the weather or the climate quite a lot. So this is also something we need to worry quite a bit. We want to make sure that we develop new technologies to make sure the agriculture product it could be sustained without without too much impact from the rising temperature. So it means a lot of technology development in agriculture, for example, the pollens, the bees, etc., making sure that they can survive, they can do their job to help the agriculture to grow and make sure that there are sufficient food for the world and also for China. So this is a part of the climate adaptation. Like we have to accept what's happening now, what's already here, and adapt our technologies to make sure that people's life is not severely impacted.
Okay, let's go to Phoenix to Mohammed Mahmoud. Great to have you with us. This report now follows earlier reports talking about rising sea levels. Let's listen.
Rising seas are sinking futures. Sea level rise is not only a threat in itself, it is a threat multiplier. For the hundreds of millions of people living in small island developing states and other low-lying coastal areas around the world, sea level rise is a torrent of trouble. Rising seas threaten lives and jeopardize access to water, food, and health care.
So, Mohammed, countries in the Middle East are facing the threat of rising sea levels. We've also just seen serious flooding in Somalia, in the Horn of Africa. What does this latest warning mean for countries in the region?
You know, unfortunately, with sea level rise, this is not necessarily a new warning. This is something we've known for a while, and several of the iterations for the reporting from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The thing about sea level rise and its impact as it's propagated because of climate change, it's sort of a slow-moving impact. It's incremental through time, so sometimes the effects are not seen quite drastically and quite dramatically, such as other impacts, such as extreme weather. But the bigger concern about sea level rise is shifting or altering its trajectory is something that would occur in a sequence of centuries, not even decades. And what I mean by that is, if we are even tomorrow magically able to reduce all emissions that contribute towards the warming of the oceans and towards this trajectory of sea level rise, it would take centuries for that trajectory of encroachment into coastal areas to stop, let alone to reverse. So with the rate of warming, with the rate of emissions that's occurring, this encroachment of sea level rise is going to persist for centuries to come. And of course, the risk with that is several-fold. One is inundation of coastal areas, but more importantly, what is along those coastal areas? A lot of those nations in the Middle East, North Africa region, which are already naturally prone to being water scarce, rely on desalination as a huge source of their water supply portfolio. That critical infrastructure could be submerged. Another aspect is looking at agricultural areas that tend to boost and support local food production and food security. If we think of places like Egypt and the Delta on the Mediterranean, a lot of their agricultural land, their hub really of agricultural production is along that area. You have the risk of losing critical parcels of land that are productive in terms of food production. And another just sort of link to that is not just the sea level rise, but with warming of the oceans, we have an acceleration potential of more extreme weather, cyclones, thunderstorms. As these coastal areas are shrinking, areas where human populations reside are suddenly now even much closer to impact areas for these types of extreme weather activity. So it's not just the impact of sea level rise in the long term, but these other compounding impacts amplifying because of the encroachment on coastal areas.
So, Mohammed, just one point briefly, if you can, please. I mean, you talk about slow moving and the consequences of this spanning centuries. I mean, are we already past that tipping point?
Well, the tipping point when it comes to sea level rise, you could argue, is moving. I wouldn't say it's over, but in terms of that point in the future where we're able to halt it, it keeps moving further away if we don't directly address the emission issue.
Sean, the WMO Secretary General also voiced very serious concerns about the impact of what would happen, rising temperatures in the Arctic. Let's listen.
The most dramatic changes we expect to happen see in the Arctic, where we have already seen more than double the global warming taking place, and during the coming 5 years, the estimation is that the Arctic temperatures would be 3 times the global averages. So we will see more dramatic impacts there.
Now, you've spent time in the area. You've been in Greenland. You've been reporting extensively on what's going on there. I mean, how devastating will be these rising temperatures for the Arctic?
I think I'd go back to what Paul said. There's so many unknowns, but clearly it would be not just devastating for the Arctic, but the Arctic is the world's air conditioner, and it's going to have a ripple effect that affects every nook and cranny of the world. If you look at Greenland right now, that's the largest chunk of fresh water in the world, as I understand it, something like 10%. And the melting comes not only from warmer temperatures, but also as the ocean slaps up against the ice edges and melts there. And it's also chipping away underneath that ice sheet. There we are on top of the ice sheet, looking at some of those giant glaciers that just fall off. So it's not just the glaciers, it's just the part that continues to melt from the surface. When we went there in 2012, I believe, I can't believe it's that long ago, something like 90%, 7% of the ice sheet was melting. Now, I'm not saying it was all melting. Think of it like it's an ice cube, and the surface of the ice cube was melting, and so that runoff was causing huge problems, affecting the salinity of the water, and that affected the local fisheries, affected the local economies, and made people scratch their heads and wonder just how bad this is going to get. And I think, as the Secretary General said, the Arctic's warming up twice as fast as any other place on Earth. And there are a number of concerns there. What are called aerosol particles, and not the kind that come from a can, but just black specks. They are now absorbing the sun's energy instead of reflecting it like the ice has always done in the Arctic area. So that is also contributing to the warming. And besides from affecting the way of life for the indigenous population in that area, as I mentioned, it's so important to cooling the atmosphere of the world. And so there are huge concerns about where that's going to go. I want to also touch on something Paul talked about methane being such a huge concern. Permafrost is melting. It's called permafrost because it's supposed to be permanently frozen. Well, the very important oil pipeline that goes from Prudhoe Bay down to Valdez, that is falling in some areas because the permafrost is giving way, and that releases a significant amount of methane into the atmosphere as well. And also we've heard about dams, how dams are clean energy. Well, they're putting some dams in tropical areas, and when they build up a large water, it kills all the grasses in the area, and then when drought comes in after the rainy season, that goes down, the grasses come back up. Well, what happens when you kill grasses like that? More methane goes into the air. So I've talked to a group of scientists who are very concerned about that as well. So it's the unknown, I think, that Paul talked about is just a huge concern. You can't overstate it, but it needs attention, it needs focus, and it needs it now, because these crazy things we're seeing all over the world. I had someone from the Arctic, you saw me walking with Steve Umatuk in just a short while there. He called me in December. It was pouring rain up there in Point Hope. It was like close to 60 degrees. That never happens. And then they called me from another area. In June, they had a blizzard. So climate change doesn't necessarily mean everything's getting hotter. It means crazy weather patterns. Right. And these very powerful, devastating storms are hitting everywhere as well.
Paul, that warning from the WMO, it did come with one caveat, though. It said that this 1.5 degree increase that we're talking about, which could probably last a year, will not be permanent. What does that mean? And is that a little bit of good news for us?
We have potential to mitigate the worst of climate change. Every 1/10 of a degree is going to save millions of lives in the long term. And we need to think about it that way. We're going to have a hard time stopping temperature at 1.5 in the long run. I think most realistically, we need to stop temperature increases to 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels during this century. If we can do that, we can prevent the worst of climate change impacts, the ones I've talked about that would be truly destabilizing, cause mass crop failures, mass migration, forced migration around the world, water shortages, as Son mentioned. And one important thing to note on this, we need to create a more powerful set of economic incentives for all nations to cut their emissions. The Paris Agreement doesn't do that. The Paris Agreement is a very important voluntary accord that asks all nations to cut their own emissions voluntarily, but that's not working. China's emissions are now a third of the global total. US and China together are half of global emissions. I think you note that Europe has instituted a carbon border adjustment, essentially a carbon tax for goods entering Europe that are higher carbon value, that have higher emissions intensity. I think, and I'm going to propose shortly next month, an agreement between the G7 nations to create an alliance for clean trade that would incentivize the reduction, economic incentives for the reduction of carbon content in goods all around the world, or the countries who have high emissions intensity would pay tariffs to have their products used in those countries. We have got to create a really powerful economic incentive for countries to cut emissions deeply. Right now, we don't have that. I believe trade policy is the way for that to happen.
Yixing Xu, talking about the way ahead and the planning that needs to be done for the future. I mean, you've done a lot of work with energy transition. What does that mean and how does it work?
Yeah, definitely. I think energy transition is basically part of the climate mitigation I talked about. So energy transition means that in all the major 5 sectors in all the economy, including electricity, transportation, building, manufacturing, and agriculture, in all these 5 categories, we need to identify where are the emissions and how we can mitigate those emissions and eventually reduce the emissions all the way to net zero, which means we may still need some fossil fuel, but we have to capture those CO2 emissions from burning those fossil fuel to make it net zero. So I think climate mitigation is one of the most important things we have to do, all the country needs to do now. I think Paul also mentioned that we need to have economic incentives to basically reduce emissions. And this is part of the whole plan of the whole energy transition. So we need to have 3 major things to make it happen. One is that we need to develop very cheap technology, clean technologies. Yeah. Right now, it's like wind, solar, and energy storage are getting cheaper. And we need to massively deploy those clean technologies very fast, basically with scale and speed. We also need a policy to support that. We need to have tax credits. We need to have other incentives passed by policy to support the deployment of these technologies. And also we need to have a strong market to buy these technologies. So all these things are what we need to do climate mitigation. And this is part of the energy transition we need.
Right. Mohammed, the climate minister of the United Arab Emirates has been talking about cutting emissions. Let's hear what she had to say.
The whole outcome that we want to achieve by 2030 is, of course, slashing emissions. That's the main thing, to keep the 1.5 degrees alive. It's about making sure that we reach minimum globally 43% of emission reduction by 2030. And that's the goal that we need to try and push for. And once we come to a level where we can say, okay, we now have enough clean and renewables out there, then we can start talking about phasing out fossil fuels. But right now, it should be phase out fossil fuel emissions and phase up renewables.
So, Mohammed, we're talking here about phasing out fossil fuels. We're talking here about cutting emissions. And we're also talking about the shift to alternative sources of energy. How big a challenge is all of that?
It can be quite challenging for a number of reasons, depending on the types of countries we're talking about. Certainly countries that are higher up on the carbon or greenhouse gas emission phase or stage, their economies that were built and based on fossil fuel energy. So transitioning overnight is not quite realistic. It's quite phased approach, which I think Her Excellency the Minister was putting forth. The other piece, so besides just the phasing down of emissions from fossil fuel-based energy sources, the idea of shifting to renewables. Mostly, my opinion, a lot of that is contingent on technological innovation. So for example, when we talk about solar energy, a place like the Middle East region is an ideal place to have solar farms in place just because of the area, close to the equator, 30-degree latitude, it's absorbing a lot of solar radiation. The issue with solar energy is storing that energy at scale, right? So you're generating that energy during the day, during the nighttime, that's not the case. So the in-between stopgap is how do you store that energy to be able to utilize it when you're not absorbing those solar radiation from the sun. We have, I think through research and innovation, have developed ability to store some of that energy. The challenge to date is how do you store energy at scale, at the amounts of scales where you can start to see renewable energy sources put a dent on the energy demand portfolio for some of those countries.
Sean, you were talking earlier on about the fact that the United States pulled out of the Paris Accord. We've also seen very inconsistent efforts by the United States.
That's being kind.
To put it mildly, on the international climate change commitments. I mean, we're still in the aftermath of COVID right now. This country is preoccupied domestically with politics.
Sure.
Internationally with the Ukraine conflict. Where's it going?
Well, I think the one thing we haven't talked about that is a huge concern and needs to be feted, needs to be talked about more, is the fact that the United States is a nation that has a lot of deniers. And there aren't a lot of nations out there doing that now. There are only 2 or 3 nations that voted against the Paris Accord. One was Nicaragua because it did not do enough. And so now you have these very powerful conservative lawmakers in the United States, and they are digging in their heels. Part of the talks going on about the debt ceiling right now are focusing on Biden's plan for climate change. You're talking about $370 billion, and you're talking about new jobs, green jobs. And so if that goes away...
Okay, we are going to have to leave it there. Thank you to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.
The nature of business is to bring value. Business activities in Europe, Asia, and the U.S. reach consumers globally. Trade, manufacturing, energy, high-tech, real estate, consumption. We give an expanded view on global business and how it covers, influences, or relates to the whole world. Global business, only on CGTN.